Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the next episode of Stream Time Sports. My name is Chris Stone, I'm the community lead, joined as always by our CEO, Nick Meacham. Now, Nick, today we're going to be talking about the World Cup. And I'm just curious to know, Nick, can you remember the first World Cup that you watched?
The first one I watched, the first one I can remember watching was actually quite at an older age because Australia wasn't in the World Cup for quite a while. I didn't really pay that much attention. I might have watched, actually, no, I just had a flashback. I remember now. So, random story. I was in, I think, grade 10, I think, at the time. And I was actually doing French immersion at school. So I was doing all my subjects in French for the first 3 years of high school in Australia. Yeah, I know, random.
Yeah.
Uh, so there was a lot of patriotism around France and the French team, and they were playing, and they had an incredible team. They had like Zinedine Zidane and
Yeah.
I think Henri, and just they had like basically the world's best team or near
Yeah.
enough there. And I got on their bandwagon then, and I supported. I said, I'll jump and support them because it fits into the
Yeah.
French vibe that we've got here. And they won that year. That was a really cool experience to
Yeah.
follow them through. That was when I was in my teens, younger
Yeah.
teens, I think, from memory. So yeah, a while ago. And then my next experience is one probably over 10 years later or so
Yeah.
when Australia made the World Cup for the first
Nice.
time after like 26 years. And that's really got me into the passion and the excitement of
Cool.
following your local your national football team.
Yeah,
What
I'm,
about
I
you?
think I'm a bit similar to you, Nick. My first World Cup was in 2006. I was 16, and part of it is back then football wasn't on TV. Like you didn't have the Premier League on. Like these days, like I think a lot of Americans could tell you a lot more about football because of how prevalent it is. But when I was growing up, it didn't exist. Um, I remember when I was on the internet, Nick, it was still the dial-up days where you had to either be if you got on the internet, you couldn't use the phone at the same time. Like, uh,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I remember high school YouTube came out, but obviously no one had a YouTube strategy then. So I remember 2006, my family we'd gone to Utah for a holiday, and we swung into Vegas for 2 days at the end of it. And I remember buying a Ronaldinho jersey, Brazilian
Oh,
Ronaldinho jersey. So that was my first one in 2006 as a 16-year-old. But like, it was never on TV. Well, out the World Cup was, but like, you didn't have like the Premier League and all that stuff, filling out the calendar between them. But then I think after that, 2010, Landon Donovan had the goal that sent the U.S. through against Ghana out of group play. 2014 is one that's very close to my heart, Nick. I was interning at a sports agency. I had torn my ACL, so I had to go home for surgery, and I got my exams delayed. So I started an internship on a Monday. My last exam was on a Friday. So I had 48 hours to find a flat in London. I managed to find one, 500 quid a month in cash up front for 3 months, all bills included. The one catch was, Nick, is your shower was in the kitchen. Basically, it's this tiny little flat, and you had a hose from the sink that went to the shower. So that was the
oh,
one
that's
catch.
so London, central London
I know.
vibes. I've seen some classic things on social, but I've never heard anyone who's actually done that.
I was 21 at the time. Like, I didn't really care, but the World Cup was on. I lived next door to a pub. So I just didn't stay in the flat at all. Like, it didn't matter. It was just a play. Like, it had a mattress, fine, whatever. And I just remember that World Cup was one that was in Brazil. And the owner of the pub would let me stay up and watch the US. So he'd kick everybody else. He'd just let me sit in the bar and keep watching. So that was
Nice.
close because like, it's just one of those things. Like, I'll never forget living in that flat for a summer, but it was great because you live next door to the pub. You got to stay up all night, watch games. So yeah, but 2006 was my first World Cup, Nick, as a 16-year-old, but I think that's more of America not being very football heavy and just how much broadcast has evolved over the last couple of years. We've talked about the Premier League countless times, and some of their global domination.
And your access to a pub to watch as well always adds a
Yeah,
little bit of flavor and flair to
100%.
it. I've a pretty good. I've never been a massive football fan because it's not the first sport in
Yeah,
Australia, so I didn't grow up with that. But yeah, followed the national team once that started to get a bit of traction. But I have these three or four teams that really just come to mind when I think about the World Cup. I think about that French team that I talked about. I think about that Brazilian team you talked about. I think about the German team. That they were just so dominant the year they won it. Spain, uh, and that's probably it. They're like teams that just stood
yeah,
above the parapet. That really just wowed me and made me watch and appreciate football so much more than I do watching anyone else. But otherwise, I've never paid that much attention to it unless purely through the lens of Australia. How's
yeah,
Australia doing alone? obviously I haven't followed England. I followed
Yeah.
England a little bit in my
Yeah.
later years, but interesting to see what the atmosphere is like here in Sweden, because they just scraped into
Yeah.
the World Cup, which was getting a lot of headlines here because they got Graham Potter. You know Graham Potter, the coach.
Yeah, yeah, he was the coach at West Ham to start our relegation season this year. So yes, I unfortunately
Oh,
know him well.
oh, oh! Sorry about that. But he's taken on the Swedish job now, and he actually used to coach over here many years ago. So so he led them through. Although I think their record was something ridiculous, like they never won
Yeah,
a game and still got through somehow because everyone else basically flopped as well.
yeah,
Um, but I was on, at stage of that SVT event that I mentioned
yeah,
I've told you about in Stockholm, and the guy who was emceeing it basically said, introduced me, and basically said, yeah, I think he thought it was British or English, and he said something like
yeah.
the lines of like, "Here's basically a British guy, and this is in Swedish, but don't worry, he speaks better Swedish than Graham Potter." And I was
Oh,
like,
fair.
"I'll
No,
take
yeah,
that.
that's not.
I'll take that.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm happy with that."
yeah. Well,
So yeah, go on. You go. I'll let you
well,
go.
I was just gonna say, Nick. I made a bunch of bets that the U.S. would be good in 2026. I think I'm gonna lose those bets, but it is what it
Yeah, I
is. But
think you are.
yeah, probably.
You know they're
But
against
Nick,
Australia in the pool matches.
are they
Yeah.
nice?
So
I'll be back home
that
during
that
the World Cup. I might see that
we
game at
well
home. Yeah.
the funny thing is I got actually a lot of headlines in Australia because there was footage coming that the Americans were cheering when they got announced they had Australia in their pool, and quite frankly rightfully so. But the Aussies really took it badly, and they're like, oh, we're going to show those
Yeah.
Americans now. So there's a little bit of extra incentive and motivation on the Aussie side to beat the Americans.
I mean, we're not playing very well. You just need to show up and you might win. So,
You haven't seen our team. Like
fair.
there's like Division Two Japanese league players who are in the starting 11. So
You,
I don't think I got too much to worry about.
I'll say, not going too deep into football and tactics. You guys should at least be one of the few teams that is not as impacted by the heat. I mean, you guys should certainly
Yeah,
be okay with this temperature that we're going to have.
yeah, I think so. Actually, I think it is it's a summer sport here in the there in Australia,
Yeah,
as it is in Sweden. Actually, although
it is.
Sweden's temperatures are a little bit more milder
Yeah.
than the Americas.
But now, talking about the World Cup today, Nick, we're going to look at it from a media perspective. And obviously, for those of you who are listening to this podcast, you're probably aware that the World Cup takes place every 4 years, but it is the single largest global event that takes place. The finals in 2022, depending on which numbers you use, were around 1.5 billion viewers live. Just to give some context from my numbers, the second biggest event is the Olympics opening ceremony. That's usually around 800 million people. The T20 Cricket World Cup is the third largest, which I think largely comes from the population in India, is around somewhere to 300 to 400 million people, depending on which numbers you use. And then the Super Bowl one, I think everyone's pretty familiar with. We're talking about 125 to 150 million. So you can just see the scale of how much larger this event is than every other event out there. Now, Grant, like I said, it is every 4 years, but it is truly global appeal in a way I don't think many other sports can say. In terms of their media rights, Nick, interestingly, had some numbers. Now, FIFA, I don't think we have exact numbers, but we're going by approximations. 2010, they apparently brought in $2.4 billion in media rights deals. The next cycle is 2.5, so just a small 4% increase. Going to 2018, it went to 3.1 billion, which was almost a 25% increase. 2022, 3.4 billion, so about a 10% increase. And then this year, they're hoping to bring in just over $4 billion. So when we kind of look at all that in total, they are slowly building. I think pretty impressive numbers given it is only about a 4 week tournament. But one of the other things I think that's worth taking place, Nick, when we talk about the World Cup is there are no global deals. They, as far as I'm aware, they have about 175 different broadcast deals across the world. And we spend so much time these days talking about, the Apples and the Netflixes of the world looking for these more bundled deals. That does seem like quite a lot of work for FIFA. And I am going to have specific questions about having to do all those. And then the last thing I want to add when we're talking about some of the monetization scale and reach, and we've mentioned this on some podcasts before, but we'll talk about it a little bit more today, is for the first time they are introducing the 2 hydration breaks, which I don't think can be ignored as part of some of the things that are changing from a media broadcast landscape this year, where you'll have the opportunity for official FIFA sponsors to have commercials within those 3-minute windows of time. So, Nick, I guess kind of phrasing all of that and almost looking at the growth that it's had. One of the things you and I talk about quite a bit on the podcast is sports organizations needing to view themselves as media businesses, not just sports organization. When you think about FIFA, do you feel like there was a point that shifted where they really took the monetization and that media perspective a lot more seriously?
Yeah, that was quite a while ago. I would say if you go back into the history of FIFA World Cup, you probably can follow a little bit of when they decided to be focused on generating some income. There might have been a certain Sepp Blatter
Yeah.
involved back in the day, but they've been driving that commercial machine from strength to strength, and it's been proven and tested that if you want to be successful and you have a global property, you have to take a market by market approach. It rarely works to try and do a global deal because of the basically the ineffectiveness or the leakiness of that style and that model. And each market operates differently, right? And there's actually very few players that are truly global and don't and have a visibility in each market, because one of the major aspects of FIFA's approach and indeed also ISC's is that they have a huge sponsorship machine funding their businesses. Now, if you don't have that free to air reach component included, you do risk not having the visibility that you are offering to your partners that you're bringing on board. So they've had to take a fairly market by market and very blended approach in their rights, but it has continued to grow. I would add, though, if you break that down on a sort of cycle by cycle basis and on a inflationary basis, the numbers aren't quite as strong as they might sound. And naturally, the American market is always the most lucrative commercial market to be in. Um, After this, where do those numbers go? They've always found a way the last few cycles, but I do have a concern about how they can keep that momentum flying high.
Well, I do have a question around some of those concerns in the sense of, as of recording this, I think only as of about 48, 72 hours ago, they managed to land a deal in China, obviously an incredibly large market. As far as I'm aware, Nick, unless there's been news that I'm not aware of, India still does not have a broadcast, or FIFA doesn't have an Indian
I don't believe
broadcast
so.
partner for the World Cup, which is the largest population in the world. I get maybe we think of other markets, but like not an insignificant number for reach and scale. We've talked about on the podcast quite a bit. We've seen a stagnation of media rights in Europe. Do you think FIFA is having similar challenges with just stagnating rights? And I think as well, Nick, as you mentioned, this has happened in a couple different cycles and different events. The FIFA Club World Cup last summer was very late in the day before they managed to finalize plans. The Women's World Cup that took place, I think, in 2023, if you remember, Nick, it was very late in the window that they were managing to get deals with like England and Italy and Spain and, big European markets. Now, I think part of that had to do with the fact that that was being hosted. Was that in Australia or New Zealand, Nick?
Yes, it was. Australia and New
Yeah.
Zealand, yeah, it was across the
Yeah.
both.
So there was, I think, some issues with their perceived value versus what the time zones were. So there were, FIFA Club World Cup was kind of a new proposition. Timings didn't help out, but we've seen a couple occasions now where FIFA have struggled. So I guess, Nick, like, is that part of what your concern is that this is a part of the larger trend we're seeing with this?
Well, yeah, I also think there's that whole expectation issue where FIFA and the leadership of FIFA, Mr. Infantino, are probably leading the way there, continually says to their stakeholders, their governing bodies and federations that he oversees, that he's going to continue to drive the commercial growth of FIFA because that money that gets funded and distributed through all the respective member nations and associations, that obviously helps ensure that he gets voted in each time, as well, as you could
Yeah.
imagine. So I think that pressure by offering and promising more and more and more to a governing body. Remember, we're talking about a governing body, not a professional enterprise in theory.
Yeah.
Um, that makes it really difficult to keep that momentum that they've been talking about and suggesting. And I think fundamentally, FIFA and football has a football problem. There's just too much football in market,
Yeah.
meaning that not only is budget being spent on football in other places, but also just the attention isn't potentially there. Although FIFA will share that they've reached 25 billion people probably by the end of the World Cup, given some of the numbers they've shared. I remember Qatar, I did a post on this where they'd shared the numbers that were equivalent to like the entire world,
Our
basically
world,
every single
yeah,
person. Yeah, yeah. The number was ridiculous.
yeah,
That they'd reached everyone basically in the world, or 5 or 6 billion people. Like, did you really? Did you
yeah.
really? And that's the ultimately this issue about, I guess, like keep promising more to sponsors, to stakeholders, to the public, to the athletes, and then having to try and find a way to get there each and every time. That makes it a little bit trickier for them to keep riding that wave. And I'm not sure how they're going to pull it off for next World Cup, frankly.
Well, Nick, one of the interesting things you just mentioned there about too much football, and we've seen UEFA expand their tournament sizes, what they do on their annual basis, but also the tournament this year is moving from 32 teams up to 48 teams, and they're going from 64 matches to 108 matches. It's a 62% increase. We're not talking like small numbers. We're talking about a very chunky increase. So I guess that the question goes to you, Nick, and like part of this will be on the media rights side. Part of this is also definitely on the ticketing side. You're going to have games with some very eclectic, random matchups that, we kind of talk about, you want assets to be able to sell, sponsors want advertisement opportunities, but sure, I mean, just where is that line? We talk about the NFL does a really good job because they have such a tight schedule where someone like Major League Baseball, you know, are we hitting that point with 108 matches over the course of, 5 weeks?
Well, look, I think on a media perspective, I would say that there's a lot to like about this for a couple of reasons. One is that this means that basically 30 or 40% more markets, you're going to have the national team playing in the
Yeah.
World Cup. That hasn't always been the case, right? So you'll get people like, I don't know, people in Jamaica watching just because they want to
Like it.
watch the World Cup, not like it. But if they're not in the competition, there's obviously going to be a limited amount of national tribalism and backing and to get that maximum visibility. This just increases that. So for those smaller games, they're going to have a lot more visibility in those markets, which I think is really compelling. I don't think it's not a linear growth number in terms of visibility in the more mature markets. You're not going to see more people watching, I don't know, no hating on these guys, but like Ecuador versus French Guyana, I don't even know who's in
Yeah.
the World Cup, but like
Yeah.
two minnows is not going to get a lot of interest, and actually does sometimes get people lost in what is important to watch. Like I used to basically turn on every match that was happening in the World Cup when it was on free to air. Now, if you've got to pick and choose, you start getting a little bit, you risk starting getting a little bit
Yeah.
disconnected, I think. But I think it's a smart move for them from a media perspective. What I think is much trickier is how they fill stadiums. It's fine, and well, there's all sorts of stuff we're going to talk about, maybe about ticketing in a
Yeah.
second. But the tricky thing of when you're having so many games is how do you create such an appetite and the infrastructure to manage and deliver all of that? I think media wise, it can work for them, particularly on the global approach,
Yeah.
less so necessarily on the local approach. People aren't going to watch every game going
Yeah.
on, right? They're only going to watch
Yeah.
a handful. I think they'll just be even more selective than they ever have. People won't pick. In England, they might
Yeah.
not pick the Spain versus Germany match they would have otherwise picked before, just
Right.
because they might be a bit tired of some of that stuff. Is my estimation of what will happen.
Well, one of the things we were talking about sort of when FIFA hit that sort of new mindset and approach, obviously we're talking about this has happened much earlier, but I think something that's not insignificant was the launch of FIFA Plus, which Nick, that must have been 4 or 5 years ago now. I mean, time flies, but I remember we were talking about it at Sports Pro. It was still the OTT Summit back then, Nick. It's now gone from Sports Pro OTT Summit to Sports Pro Madrid to Sports Pro Media Summit. So I think that's how old FIFA Plus is. But just FIFA Plus does not necessarily have the premium rights. We've always talked about that. It's an ad based model, but we're talking about some of these things where there are difficulties potentially with certain markets, or just the changing landscape of the marketplace. Is there ever a world where FIFA Plus becomes a place to host some of those, or becomes an option where you're struggling to negotiate a media rights deal in a particular market that you could host it on FIFA Plus for certain countries?
Well, I don't know what the plan is these days with FIFA Plus. My
Yeah,
assumption is that it doesn't even barely exist anymore, but I've not checked it out for some
yeah,
time because they did that deal with DAZN where they basically integrated FIFA Plus into DAZN. Now, they were intentional, and I had a few conversations with people around the industry, but basically the deal was done and agreed between Mr. Infantino and DAZN, let's say Shai Sagiv, or whoever was involved. but there wasn't a lot of detail agreed to this said deal, and therefore they had to work it out afterwards. What does
Yeah,
this mean for the platform? No one would give me a straight answer. It's like, does this mean FIFA Plus is dead or not? So I generally don't know if it's actually dead as a platform. But all that's really happened is that I know of is that DAZN has a FIFA Plus destination where it's just got a whole load of archived football content on the platform. I have no idea if they're doing what they were doing at the time, which was basically broadcasting a lot of live matches for those lower clubs that couldn't get the visibility. There was an outlet and a place that they could direct all their broadcast and streaming content, and it would get picked up on those channels. What I also know is that they had huge problems trying to monetize that reach and that scale, and they tried to help the lower tier associations take advantage of that visibility that they were able to give them. But that's a really, really tricky proposition
yeah,
to do. So again, this comes down to that whole thing a bit like the media rights stuff of like expectations
yeah,
were just gargantuan for this platform. And if they just kept it a bit like, I think UEFA's taken a bit more pragmatic approach. They've just been a bit
yeah,
more pragmatic with its role and its place in market. I think FIFA Plus was such a great initiative and a really powerful platform for them to have. It's when the expectations, like the Olympic Channel as well, where they want it to be this new multi-billion-dollar revenue
yeah,
business, and it just ain't going to happen unless they
no,
start siphoning off the rights that they're looking to sell for billions of dollars. So it was always, I don't want to say it was doomed because I actually
yeah.
really loved their approach and strategy as a product. It just had a price tag on it that never gave it a chance.
Yeah, that'll happen. In terms of the business side of things, I think I read a statistic there. It's just shy of about 50% of all the revenue that FIFA will make on the World Cup does come from its broadcast rights. And obviously, you're talking about sponsorships being a big part of that, ticketing, but broadcast largely being the largest chunk of that. And we said at the top of the show, the introduction of the hydration breaks. I think, Nick, in my personal opinion, this probably won't necessarily have a massive monetization play on it simply because you're only talking about probably 4 minutes of commercials over the course of a game. Because I think the rules are it's a 3 minute hydration break and commercials have to at like 30 seconds after the break and have to end 30 seconds before the break. So like you're only talking about, I think, a couple of minutes. And I
Yeah.
think my understanding is the advertisements are exclusive to FIFA sponsors. So even local broadcasters couldn't
Really?
necessarily. Well, that's why ITV came out and said that they weren't going to do the hydration break commercials because they said, in the UK, you can only have so many commercial minutes per hour that they chose
Hmm.
to rather have the end game and halftime ones. But I think I also read somewhere that FIFA was holding those to be exclusive for FIFA sponsors. So like you were limited on the amount of money. Maybe we'll check that. And maybe I'll come back with a little correction in the bio if I'm wrong on that, Nick. But I think I read somewhere there are limitations on who can have those ad breaks,
Oh, that would
similar
be
to the
interesting if.
Masters.
Yeah, that would be interesting if that is the case. I was just thinking the same thing when we had that conversation about the Masters and the
Yeah,
exclusivity that they were getting as a result of that. That would surprise me if that was the case, but who knows? But I think the
yeah,
objective of the hydration break isn't just about monetization today.
yeah,
I think this is a longer term play
yeah,
to basically integrate these types of breaks into football because, quite frankly, I think football needs it. Firstly, I think it needs it because of the focus and attention in a 45-minute match is trickier than I think it has been. Some will contest that and they'll say, they can say
yeah,
that attention spans are actually not dwindling. But for a match that's not end to end exciting stuff, you can lose people along the
yeah,
way. And because of what we've talked about, that monetization challenge in a whole host of markets and the monetization opportunity in markets like the US, adding significant ad breaks will drive, no doubt, significantly more income for those broadcasters that lean into that. And that's why this is the starting point. They're able to find a loophole to make this work. And I think this will not be the end. I think you will see it in various competitions sooner rather than later. Not all necessarily, particularly the ones that aren't built on advertising-led monetization offerings. So maybe not in the Premier League initially for quite some time because it's funded by Sky Sports and pay TV largely. But for those that have an ad-funded marketplace or need ad-funded to drive up the value, I think you're going to see this be something that everyone's going to want to lean to over time. And FIFA's taken the shot here, and they can because they're the
yeah.
governing body. And maybe no one will do it until the next World Cup, and they'll still be able to lean into that. But
Yeah.
it will start to embed that this is okay to be in the experience, and that's really, I think, at least if they get nothing more than marginal revenue gains for the broadcasters this time around, but sort of a acceptance of this as the future, that'll be a huge win for them for again monetization and growth perspective of the economy around football.
I agree with you, Nick. I don't think it's about what's happening this year, but what happens long term. And I think it's not even about the hydration breaks because I could see where you're like, hey, we're playing in England in January, like, don't need a hydration break. But what I think it is similar to what we saw in Six Nations, it becomes a potential pathway for in game advertising where it might not necessarily be a hydration break where we stop, but as we've talked about before, there's a injury on the pitch or there's something going on. It's a screen in. What do they call the screen in screen commercials? You know what I'm talking about? Where like just in the small corner, there's a specific word for it, Nick.
You mean overlays or like overlay ads or the ones
Maybe
in the in
picture
play
in.
ads?
Yeah,
Yeah,
basically, Nick.
picture, yeah, in picture, yeah.
Yeah, but basically, that's what I think this is the gateway to.
Yeah, I think so as well. I think this is basically they need to do this. They need to make it more viable, and probably a lot of leagues are too afraid to do it because of the fan pushback if it
Yeah,
happens. But FIFA doesn't really have that concern because I think they
no,
kind of have a bit of a brand, which
yeah,
is to commercialize the sport as effectively as possible. So it kind of will help that. So I'm intrigued to see what how quickly there is adoption of this, but I think more and more will want to lean into this sooner rather than later. And I actually think, on the sporting perspective, it will have to change the sport.
yeah,
I think you're going to have to see, you're going to end up seeing athletes having to be even fitter than before because they're going to work in like little sprints, a bit like,
yeah,
four quarters of basketball, right? Where you've got that period where you can push a little bit harder because you're getting
yeah,
at a break in a couple of minutes. But normally that might be a lull 25 minutes in. Now this could be,
yeah.
we're pushing to that break. So I think it'll change the game over time.
Yeah, we will see. Now, Nick, on the media side, that's the broadcast side, but they are taking a different approach when it comes to reach and scale with the introduction of preferred platforms. This year, they've announced that they're going to have both TikTok and YouTube as preferred platforms. Now, both of these are going to have some similar content. Some of them are going to have some different options. So, with TikTok, it's going to be heavily focused on creator content, behind the scenes access, a range of archive content. And then, similar to what we saw in the Club World Cup, is a TikTok World Cup hub, which is going to kind of be that place where everything is centralized. Official media partners are going to be allowed to monetize certain parts of the matches and monetize their own content there. For YouTube, for licensed broadcasters, they're going to be able to stream up to the first 10 minutes live of every match from their official YouTube channels before people are going to have to then switch over to the official broadcaster. They're also FIFA is pledging to have um, full past length matches from historic games on the platform, and there will also be YouTube creators being granted access on the ground to capture moments from the tournament. And then, just as another side piece, someone we've talked about, but it's worth mentioning again, is Brazilian streamer Casemiro and Casa TV will be live streaming exclusively in Brazil. No, not exclusively. He will be streaming in Brazil. So, Nick, we have these preferred platforms that YouTube or with YouTube and TikTok that FIFA's talking about. So, from your perspective, what does that actually mean for FIFA to call them preferred platforms? Is it just a marketing label, or does this really represent a shift in distribution?
Yeah, it was an interesting topic. I've had a number of people who speak to me about this, and actually, the SVT event that I was involved with in Stockholm, that was something that we talked quite a bit about. What I would say is, I'll ask you this question
All right,
before I answer the Chris.
hit
So,
me.
it's like, well, firstly, I'll answer the first bit about marketing, and then
Yeah,
I'll ask you the question I was asked as well. Look, I think firstly, it is a bit of both. It is basically FIFA coming up with a new way of engaging the big tech platforms to spend a bit of money on the marketing side, but also unlock potentially a new ecosystem around their content, around football, around FIFA, the FIFA World Cup. And I really like the concept of it from that point of view. Um, the question I have to you is, what would you do if you were running a massive major broadcaster? What would you lean into this model and lean into the having 10 minutes on TikTok and 10 minutes on YouTube, or would you steer away from them?
Guess question is how much effort? I guess for me, I'm thinking about how much squeeze of that piece of fruit is going to give me how much juice. I don't know how complicated that is to necessarily. I mean, I would like to think these days live streaming can be set up pretty quickly, but I also know that some of these teams aren't always maybe is have as many people on site as possible. So I just it feels like it might be a lot of work for something that you might not be able to tangibly say gives you a lot of squeeze or a lot of juice. But maybe the
Yeah.
argument is you're not squeezing that hard, so any juice is appreciated.
Oh, there's too much squeezing and juicing
Yeah,
going on there.
yeah, yeah,
I would say, look, I think it'll be fairly straightforward. The idea is for it to be as seamless and frictionless as possible. So let's
yeah,
say you're on a requisite platform, one click and you should be basically on
yeah,
the broadcaster in markets on platform to watch.
yeah,
It's going to be
yeah,
trying to be as seamless as that. Now, obviously, the technicalities come when you talk about whether it's a paywall
yeah,
environment or a non-paywall environment. Now, the question that was raised to me is like, well, do we really want to be helping TikTok and YouTube building audiences and getting our audiences on their platforms?
yeah,
And this comes to this more existential question about how do you view a platform, particularly a platform like
yeah,
YouTube? Do you view it as a platform that you're giving your rights to, or do you view it as a distribution portal, a distribution channel, in the same way
yeah,
that Fast TV or OTA or an OTT platform are?
yeah,
And this is the conundrum. I don't say I haven't got an answer on this. Well, I can give you my view, but I don't,
yeah,
I'm very like open minded to being swayed. But
yeah,
I think you have to look at YouTube as a distribution channel for your content, for your
yeah,
network, for your platform. And if you look at it through that lens, it just means you can reach other audiences through that. As long as you're able to aggregate and justify that value um, of the sum of all parts and not treat it as something that's cannibalizing your other
yeah,
channels, which I think the perception of this could well be. It could be perceived by some as it's cannibalizing the audiences that they want to have on their own owned and operated platforms. And that is really understandable. So I think it's an incredible test case for us to see how much of this approach can really drive engagement on those platforms, but also funnel people to the rights owners themselves. It's going to be it's one of the most interesting test cases and case studies I think we've had in the industry in terms of from an event based perspective that I can think of in recent times.
Well, I think we maybe spoke about it when BBC signed the deal with YouTube in terms of that partnership they were going to do, which is I don't know what granularity we're going to get on some of that data, but what happens if we see we'll just use good round numbers, 100 people were watching on YouTube, and then when the 10 minutes changed, only two more people watched the official live stream. What does that tell you? I mean, that's a very severe drop off. But let's just say like there's a even a 50% drop off between YouTube to not switching over. What does that say existentially in terms of like, do we need to be on YouTube more? Does YouTube need to be the home of things? I feel like those numbers, depending on what granularity we get for it, could tell you various different things.
Yeah, I think there'll be a lot there because of the scale of what we're talking about. There should be a lot of conclusions we can generate of this. I think the challenge or the existential challenge that's going to be a deciding factor here is what is ultimately the rights holder. What is their objective? What is their business? And what I mean by that is, my view is if you're a public service broadcaster, you are trying to serve the public, right?
Yeah,
So you need to be where they need to be. You need to be distributed in the appropriate places, and as many of the public as possible consume the content that you are delivering. That's your duty. The difference is if you're a paid platform or a cable operator or pay TV provider, um, you're needing to turn that visibility on those platforms into cold hard cash at some stage. Monetization value can be retention potentially as well. Even people discovering that you've got it on and will go back to their own accounts, but it has to turn into meaningful value
yeah,
for those parties. So I think it's more valuable for someone that's publishing free to air and just can use the visibility in multiple ways, or just has a duty in a public service broadcaster's perspective of serving the community and the public. But it is much trickier, um, I think, for say, let's say DAZN, if they were to have the World Cup, which they do not, but if they
yeah.
did, how do they funnel people through to become meaningfully valuable subscribers in this instance to their platform? Now, there was a case of some of this which TikTok have tried to do with the Club World Cup.
Yep.
Can't remember if it was the live broadcast was also included, but from what I've heard, DAZN struggled to keep those people as subscribers, but they did get loads of people subscribing from that journey.
Yeah.
So it is tricky. It's going to be a fascinating case. There's going to be loads to learn from it, and there might be a case that we come out afterward and go, all right, well, this type of approach really works for these people. It doesn't actually work for them, but
Yeah.
that is okay. So I'm very, very fascinated to see what happens.
Well, it sort of leads me. We've talked about social media being a bit of a leaky bucket. Where can FIFA effectively balance reach and scale through their preferred platforms while also driving revenue, which is largely the broadcasters? We talked about that, apparently around $4 billion. That's coming from broadcasters. That's not coming from TikTok and YouTube. Is, can they effectively balance out those two things to not over service, or over provide value to the social media platforms? Because if that does impact broadcasters, that impacts their bottom line, and just finding that balance between the two.
What 100%, because it could be that this sort of like little concern I've got is that they don't doesn't work, and neither basically the ultimate the rights holder that's buying the rights and spending the most money does not get the requisite value from
Yeah.
that reach. And if that happens, then we know that YouTube and TikTok, whilst they may have invested in this preferred platform opportunity, ain't going to be forking out the balance there if it is really
Yeah.
significant. At least not in the near future. I believe that TikTok and YouTube want to show their wares as this conduit between live sports content and funneling to rights owners. They don't want to necessarily be the sole destination
Yeah.
alone. They would love to be, probably in some ways, but basically they accept that that's not going to be the case. And if they can act as a really solid conduit, they kind of get the best of both worlds. They get long tail, they get really serious engagement on their platforms with premium content, and they can drive value for some of these broadcasters. And I would expect potentially at some stage you might see some sort of affiliate style relationship happening between the
Yeah.
broadcasters and those platforms if it does work as well as it could.
Now, specifically looking at Casa TV in Brazil, we've obviously talked about, we think creators have a space moving forward. In presentations we've done, we've talked about how in Europe we've seen content creators become broadcasters with smaller tier rights. Obviously, we're not talking about small tier rights here. We're talking about arguably the most premier rights in the world. With something like Casa TV, is that something you think, at least at this scale, is replicable in other markets? Or do you think this is something unique to Brazil because Brazil might not be as mature as like an American market or the UK market in terms of some of those long established broadcast relationships?
I think it's trickier in a lot of markets. We do know that the Calze TV's leadership live mode, who we've had on the podcast a number of times, are launching a version of this in Portugal. So, and that they're going to include the World Cup rights there as well. So
Yeah.
I'm very intrigued to see if that process works. They're backed by, US backers to try and grow and scale this in other markets. So, but the difference is in the Portugal project, they are basically starting from carte blanche. They're building a new platform. They're not doing it through Kaze TV's established audience. So they are building basically completely from scratch. So can they get the instant reach and visibility that they need to make that successful? Now, YouTube will be heavily supporting them from a strategic
Yeah.
perspective, possibly even supporting them from an engagement and algorithm perspective to make sure that the visibility of what Kaze TV is doing in Brazil, but also in Portugal, is as effective as possible because they want more people taking this style of approach. The challenge is that the monetization still with YouTube is still tricky. It's still not anywhere near it needs to be in comparison to accessing the advertising dollars that exist in linear and traditional platforms. So, in certain markets where that is the case, where it's basically it's immature, there isn't a really robust and heavily invested into broadcast market, then I think a Brazil situation could play out again in the future. But it's important to note that Kaze TV, they're leaning into YouTube. It's not YouTube alone. They've built their own platform and they do distribute on different devices. They have their own destination in addition to YouTube. But YouTube is their life force, their bread and butter, and their established subscriber base. But I think you'll see it happen over time. But I think it's trickier than we live in a very copycat world, right? Normally you see loads of people trying this stuff, but I think most people are kind of aware that it is trickier than it might appear.
Yes. Well, Nick, the last thing we're going to touch on is not maybe necessarily directly, we'll call it media adjacent, which is we'll talk about the ticketing because I do think the in-game atmosphere does have some impact on it. But one of the things that has been talked about quite a lot in the build up to this is the cost of tickets and the difference in pricing. Based on statistics and figures you can find from the last World Cup to this World Cup, there's a 300% increase or up to 300% increase depending on which category of tickets you're going to. And the jump between previous years was on a much smaller scale. Obviously, we understand um, uh, inflation, particularly these days, and macroeconomics is a thing, but it is continuing to go up quite significantly. And I think one of the other things as well, Nick, there's two other elements of this is the first time that the World Cup has introduced dynamic pricing, which in FIFA's defense is not, they're not the only people doing this. It's happened quite a bit in the music industry, I think is where this really took off. We do see it in other sporting events. Now we can argue whether or not that is morally acceptable that you can just actively change prices up and down on certain commodities, but it is something new that fans are having to adjust to. The other thing is FIFA now has their official resale platform, which is the only way you can resell tickets. And what's interesting is they get a 30% cut of all resold tickets, 15% from the seller, 15% from the buyer. So if you did manage to land a ticket through the lottery system, you would have to sell it at a 15% increase to what you bought it to get your face value back. Just kind of the way those math works out. So you couldn't even resell tickets without losing money. Take it back. You couldn't resell them at face value without losing money. So I think there's a bit of frustration in the sense of the price that's going up, the application of dynamic ticketing, the resell one. And the other thing, Nick, that I can't validate because I've not been there, but the Athletic, who would be my resource for this, is there was a bit of a kerfuffle. That's a fun little word to say. That people bought tickets in certain categories, and then when they came back to see the tickets, they had been moved to different categories. I cannot necessarily validate that, Nick, but the Athletic is usually filled with some pretty good people, and they had some stories on it. But nonetheless, ticketing has come up as a bit of an issue. I don't think we can deny some of the political issues and whether people want to travel to the U.S. at the moment. But ticketing, this is going to be an incredibly expensive event for people to go to. And I guess, Nick, when we're talking about, the broadcast, if broadcast is about mass reach and ticketing is now becoming more of this premium event, are we essentially seeing FIFA delineate between audience and customers, where the broadcast is about the audience, where the ticketing is about customers? Are we seeing this sort of almost two-tier system between the broadcast versus being in person?
Interesting way to put it. I do think this comes down to, again, just they can take this approach
Yeah,
because there's the financial opportunity to do so. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it. It'll be absolutely awful optics for them if they have empty stadiums right across the US in the earlier stages, which is almost, it feels inevitable. But
yeah,
if they're taking dynamic ticketing to its true value, that means that if in those stadiums that aren't selling well, prices should go down and
yeah.
be more available at a better price to what they were trying to sell from in the future. So that's the glass half full. But I think the reality is it's been terrible optics, terrible for them politically to have this type of issue in place. And there's again another example of where it feels like Thief is just trying to extract every dollar it can out of its audience base and customers. Now, ultimately, what they need to do is fill the stadiums, create a great atmosphere,
Yeah.
and that will definitely help their broadcast product, which is their most important aspect of their business. So as long as they
Yeah.
do that, in the end, we won't be having this conversation too much for a while after the event. But if the stadiums are empty at all, you're going to hear about it, and it will not be a good look for them.
Well, I think one of the things with the World Cup, and this is very similar to the Olympics, is you can never predict what some of the stories are going to be. But when you have an event that takes place over the course of 5 weeks, you start getting these stories that you couldn't necessarily anticipate. I mentioned there was I think he was maybe Danish athlete at the Paris Olympics that did a rating of different French pastries, kind of thing you couldn't predict. These sorts of things come up. I feel like the fans at the World Cup typically provide some of those stories, some of those narratives, because they're so just vibrant and bringing stuff to the actual event that you almost need them to fill it out. I don't think you can do just 5 consecutive weeks of hardcore football. You need those extra little stories that fill in the gaps in between. So I think, Nick, you alluded to the fact like it would be bad optics from a broadcast perspective, but so you do believe that not having those fans in an authentic manner, would actually impact the broadcast experience. We can't just ignore it as no one's going to notice, sort of thing.
Oh yeah, you remember in during COVID when there were empty
Yep.
stadiums and there's
Yeah.
tech companies bringing their
Fake noise. Yeah.
fake
Yeah.
noise, fake news,
Yeah.
a fake crowd noise in to try and simulate that experience for the TV as much as anything, and even for the players. I think it was quite a surreal experience. The fact that they need to do it, but actually, if you've ever experienced a venue like that without the crowd, it is a very different vibe. Um,
Yeah.
I'm intrigued to see how that does rate and that does review because ultimately America is known for its commercialization, but also its
Yeah.
entertainment factor. And whether that really shines in those types of events or whether they follow a very traditional, kind of bland
Yeah.
sporting experience, which football is largely not really seen as like the most entertainment centric
Yeah.
Americanized sport, right? It is quite
Yeah.
traditional in its values there. So I am intrigued to see if that filters through. But uh, I think it's they've had a lot of bad optics, and the ticketing saga is
Yeah.
certainly one of them. But and final bit I'll add is your point earlier about or the question around how they move people and tickets around. I mean, just I'd love to know the details there. I'm
Yeah.
only guessing is they worked out after the fact
Yeah.
that, oh, you know what, we can squeeze a few more people in this section here and charge a load
Yeah.
more money, and that's why we've done that, which is what it looks like. It may not be
Yeah.
true, but it's not a good look.
No, and I guess more on an existential one to wrap up the ticketing question, Nick. Is FIFA underrating or are they properly rating any potential concern about the disconnect between in stadium and global viewers, just kind of weakening the overall fan ecosystem? Or are they maybe taking the approach that the World Cup's too big to fail? Yes, people might be upset about the optics, they might be upset about other things, but kind of the classic, if you build it, they will come. People are just going to come. Are they
Well,
really at risk of that?
I think that basically, there's always been conjecture around the World Cup and around the Olympics that there's a lot of people being negative about what's going to happen, whether this
Yeah,
event's going to be delivered. They ultimately do deliver, and they ultimately talk very macro about the events are a success or not. Most of the time, they do
yeah,
talk about them as a success. Ultimately, if we get to the event day and the grounds are full, and look, let's be honest, if they can't fill the stadiums with dynamic ticket pricing and you can't give it to kids and students or whatever in
yeah,
certain places to fill them, you're not trying hard enough. So I think
yeah,
they'll find that they should find a way, particularly in the US, to make sure those stadiums are full, even if they won't maybe not admit to how they got there. But I can't
yeah,
see in a market of entertainment like the US that they can't get there. I think that's why they took this approach in the
yeah,
US. They thought it would work more effectively. But again, and I'd love to know, and I don't know if anyone knows this, but like, what is the split between domestic to international guests they're expecting? Because
yeah.
I'm guessing it's quite high given the international nature of the World Cup. So I'm assuming it's the majority is actually international. And if so, this will price a lot of people out of it. But
Yeah,
the people that can afford it will, ultimately
yeah.
pay the price and probably have just as good an experience. But they will see it through a slightly different lens when you've got to pay 3 or 4 times what you were hoping for.
So, the last thing we'll wrap things up on, Nick. Is there anything particular you are looking out for? Anything you're looking forward to? Things that you're going to watch? I mean, I think for me, I will be on holiday the first 2 weeks of the World Cup back at home in America. So I'll be interested just to kind of see the difference in coverage, difference in sort of just the vibe. It'll be good to be in the home country. Unfortunately, Cincinnati was not selected as a city, although it should have been. I won't not bitter at all. But I will say, Nick, for anyone that's British that's listening, will get this. There is something really nice about a beer garden, and the fact that it's in America. There'll be a couple games that are a bit late, but I think I've looked at England. I think England's like latest game. I think they have one game after midnight, and it's on like a weekend, so it'll be okay. But like, it is going to be really nice sitting in a beer garden, just watching football late night.
Yeah, it sure will be. I do think there's something special about the World Cup, and I think you've got to, and the patriotism I think that goes behind it. I think
Yeah,
just the patriotism that happens in those moments. If you're in a big crowd with people in a pub, around with friends, whatever it is, there's not much that matches it
yeah,
if things go to plan.
yeah,
Also, it can also go the other way. It can be a lot of
yeah,
heartache, but generally, it can be a really amazing experience if things go well. So, I do think there's very few, if any, sporting events
yeah,
that drives that sort of mateship, that tribalism,
yeah,
that type of dynamic. Um, maybe you could say like rugby in certain countries, but not
Yeah,
the global scale, right? That has that national identity to it that brings people
yeah,
together in that way. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I'm not sure what I'm going to do around it, how I'm going to
yeah,
watch it and engage with it. It's on a lot of free to air here, but I'll definitely try and make sure I see it in some
yeah.
sort of public settings to get a real feel for it from a local perspective as well.
Well, I know it'll be on in the offices at Sports Pro if the games are on while we're there. There'll be lots of late nights, lots of beer gardens. So I'm looking forward to it, Nick, despite it's been a bit of a slow burn. I feel like there's been years I've been more excited about it coming up. I feel like it's not quite hit quite the same. I think because some of the other stuff going around, but I do think once everything gets going, I will very much be wrapped up in it.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. And come on, the Socceroos. What a great name
Yeah,
that is, the Socceroos.
it is a good name to be fair. What do they call the women's team? Don't they have their own name?
Oh, they do Matildas. They're the
Is it the
Matildas.
Matildas? Yeah. There you go. Nice.
A
See,
bit
there's
of a random one.
my random knowledge. Yeah.
My favorite one is favorite one from New Zealand is you obviously have the All Blacks. The
Yeah.
basketball team's called the Tall Blacks, basically because
Ah, that
yeah,
is
right. So
great.
yeah, it's a simple one, but it
Awesome. Well,
works, right?
everyone. Yeah. Yeah, but no, it's good. It's funny. We like good dad jokes like that, Nick. Awesome. Well, everyone, thank you for joining us, and I hope you guys enjoyed the World Cup as well. If you have any thoughts on it, definitely do let us know. Things that you're looking out for, anything that we missed along the way. But thank you once again for joining us for this episode of Stream Time Sports.